This is figure 11.6 in our textbook, and it represents macroeconomic disequilibrium. The first thing to remember is that equilibrium doesn't mean good. It just means there's no tendency to change. So when a book is on a table, it's in equilibrium because the forces exerting up on the book and down on the table are going to be there for the next 1,000 years unless somebody applies the force one way or another. So remember that equilibrium doesn't mean good. That was Keynes's whole message during the Depression. He said there can be a below full employment equilibrium. The other side said no, it can't be. Things will eventually adjust themselves and we'll eventually get back to full employment. So it was a difference of opinion from the get-go. So what we have here is a graph of a recession. And before we talk about that, let's talk about the axes. So the vertical axis is price level. It's not the price of an individual item like the price of a Coca-Cola. That was back in chapter 3. Now we're dealing with the overall price level. So that's very much different from the chapter 3. On the horizontal axis, we're dealing with real output, which means it's been adjusted for inflation. And when we have the equilibrium here, in other words, where the aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve intersect at point E right here, we have an equilibrium output, but notice that the equilibrium is below full employment. The full employment level is here at Q sub F. So this is what we would call a recessionary gap. And that would mean that there was unemployment. That would mean that the gap between what you could have produced and what you did produce was getting wider. So let's look at some solutions. Here's what a Keynesian would do. If we're trying to solve a recessionary gap, remember that the equilibrium output is below the full employment output, or to say the same thing in a different way, the full employment outlook is to the right-hand side of the equilibrium. So what a Keynesian will do is he will do something on the demand side of the equation. He will move the C plus I plus G, or the aggregate demand curve, to the right to the place where it intersects with the new full employment line. I just put this little orange line in here right at the full employment level. So the aggregate demand curve theoretically has been moved to the right to the place where the new aggregate demand curve intersects the aggregate supply curve at the full employment level. And again, what a Keynesian would do, he would do something with monetary policy to cause investment to go up, and he would do something with fiscal policy to cause consumption to go up and government to go up, maybe buy another aircraft carrier. All right, so let's see what a classical or supply side person would do. I'm just reproduce the same graph. So here's the aggregate demand curve intersecting the aggregate supply curve at point E, and we notice still the same situation. The full employment is to the left, the equilibrium level is to the left of the full employment level. So what a classical or supply side person will do, he will do something to cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. And he might do such things as lowering taxes, might reduce red tape and paperwork, might increase workforce training, might modify immigration policy. It kind of has a Field of Dreams quality. You remember the movie, The Field of Dreams? So it's like if it's built, they will come. So on the supply side, they think, as the name would suggest, that the supply drives the economy, whereas Keynes thought the economy was driven from the demand side. All right, let's go to the next graph. And sometimes I get confused when you get too many lines on a graph. So this is just the original graph we looked at, and I've added both the aggregate demand curve here. So this is where the Keynesian would solve the problem, and then we move the blue line, the aggregate supply curve, over here, and it's where it intersected at the full employment level. So now let's look at a different situation. We were looking at a recessionary gap where there was unemployment. Let's look at an inflationary gap. So this is the basic lines drawn on that previous figure. And notice the difference here. The full employment is to the left of the equilibrium. In other words, it's reversed from what it was beforehand. So this distance here is called an inflationary gap because the equilibrium output is to the right-hand side of the full employment level. So what we have are too many dollars chasing too few goods. You know, that's our basic definition of inflation. So let's see how we would solve that. If we were, wait a minute, time out. Here we go. If we were a Keynesian, our solution would be to move the aggregate demand curve to the left to where it now intersects with the new aggregate supply curve at the full employment level. So we would have done that using C plus I plus G, that whole business, except we would have used it in reverse from where we were talking about earlier. Now let's see what the classical solution, you probably can already figure what it would be. You move the aggregate supply curve to the left to where it intersects with the aggregate demand curve at the full employment level. So what we see, the classical system stresses the supply side and calls for minimum government intervention. The Keynesian system stresses the demand side and looks for active government intervention. Keynes thought the economy was stable, but the classical folks thought the opposite. So the two different camps represent two different sets of assumptions about the world and two different sets of policies to fix the perceived problems. So they really do, the Keynesians and the supply-siders, they look at the world in totally different ways. So it's no wonder that they have different answers to the problems.